fun part. We actually get to start sewing the garment together. Now, I realized that I never actually told you that you need to get matching thread. So make sure you have some thread that matches close enough. Unless I'm sewing something for another person, I am kind of loosey-goosey when it comes to thread color. As long as it's close enough, nobody's gonna come up to you and say, oh my gosh, you use thread that does not match your fabric. That is all in our own heads. So use what you have if you can, or get some matching thread. Now that you've got matching thread, you've got all your pattern pieces cut out, we've got our bias tape, we are ready to get started. So I will be walking through each step. Obviously, you can head over to the pattern if you like to see the written instructions as well. Just follow along as we go. So the first step, and most important step, even though I am lazy sometimes and forget to do it, is the stay stitching. Now, especially if you're working with a fabric like this that's got rayon content or other sort of shifty fabric, you are going to want to make sure that you do stay stitching, because as much as we can avoid handling the fabric too much, you're still going to be pressing and gathering and doing all of these other things, manipulating the fabric. And so if you aren't careful, by the time you start putting certain edges together, some may have grown. So stay stitching is a great first step, and I highly, highly recommend it. The thing with stay stitching is you're going to just leave it as a normal stitch length. With basting, we always lengthen the stitch length, but the whole point of stay stitching is so that the fabric doesn't move around or shift, especially those edges that are cut like at an angle. So set your machine to your standard stitch. I like to sew with a stitch length of about 2.9 or 3. But whatever you prefer as your sort of standard straight stitch settings. I'm going to go over the different parts of the pattern pieces that I think are most important to do the stay stitching on. You're going to want to make sure you go up the shoulder seam. So go up the entire shoulder seam and around the back neck, and then down the other shoulder seam. If you notice, if you look at the fabric, that is nearly cut at a 45-degree angle, which means that as you move it around, that is gonna grow. So just sew up one shoulder seam around the back neck and down the other one. The other seams are probably okay, so you can then set this piece aside. So the front yoke piece is pretty similar in that you're gonna go up that shoulder seam, and when you get to this front neckline, just go down the front neckline. The front neckline and the shoulder seam. Same as the back, but this is also cut at quite an angle in the front, and so you want to make sure you secure that. Now, with stay stitching, you will be doing that stitch within the seam allowance. So the seam allowance on this whole pattern is 5/8 of an inch, unless I tell you otherwise. So go ahead and sew your stay stitching somewhere in that 5/8 of an inch. Now for the front and back lower pieces, the top edge of those pieces are slightly at an angle. If you wanted to stay stitch those, you could. It's not as important. But what I would do, stay stitch this underarm curve, because we do get quite a bit of movement through there. So do that on both the front lower pieces and the back lower pieces. So those are really the only places that you really want to make sure that you stay stitch. But as I mentioned before, try to avoid playing with your fabric too much, moving it around unless you have to, because it does stretch out over time, especially if it's like hanging. Okay, now you're ready. Let's take it to the machine and we will do some stay stitching. stitching done, you can set both of the front yokes and the back yoke aside, because right now we're going to focus on gathering between the notches on both the front lower and the back lower. We will start with the lower front piece. Now, make sure that your notches are clearly marked. If you need to, mark them again with chalk, or I really like the friction pen. So just make sure that they're really clear. Now, we are going to be gathering between the two notches to match the notches on the front yoke. So I know gathering is sometimes not the most fun to do, and I felt the same way until I changed the way that I gather, and now it just is a pretty straightforward process. So I will be showing you how I gather, but let's talk about it before we take it over to the machine. So the most important thing is that you need to lengthen your stitch. So remember, for my regular straight stitch, I use a stitch length of about 2.9 or 3, depending on how many times I press that button. And if you are doing a gathering stitch, you will be lengthening that to like a 4.5. So basically a really, really long stitch. So the reason that we lengthen that gathering stitch so much is so that not only does the fabric sort of move through the stitch while we're gathering it, but also once we have sewn the pieces together, those gathering stitches just pull right out of the fabric. So they're there to help you, but you don't need them there once you have sewn the pieces together. When you take the piece to your sewing machine, you are going to be sewing 2 lines of gathering stitches. So you will be sewing a line of gathering stitches that is 3/8 of an inch from this top edge, and then another that is 3/4 of an inch from the top edge. Now, the reason we do that is so that we have 2 strings that we pull together. You get far more even distribution of the gathers. But also, when we sew the yoke to the lower piece, you actually end up sewing the pieces together between those 2 lines of gathering stitches. Now, the reason this is such a game changer is because it really holds your gathers in place while you are sewing them. A lot of times, if you sew 1 line of gathering stitches and then you sew the garment together below that line of gathering stitches, it's not uncommon to get lots of like flat areas because there was nothing holding those gathers beyond the gathering stitch. So by doing 2 rows and then sewing them together between the 2 rows, your gathers end up looking much more uniform, or at least a little bit more evenly distributed. The other thing to know about doing gathering stitches is that you need to leave a long tail of thread at both the beginning and the end of the stitching. That is so that we can grab the 2 tails from the bobbin and pull those. If you cut them off really close, you have nothing to hold on to when you're gathering. So just remember to leave a long tail at the beginning and the end of your sewing. So let's take both front lowers and back lower to the sewing machine and let's sew some gathering stitches. All of your pieces gathered, you've got all those gathering stitches sewn. Before we start actually gathering the fabric, let's go ahead and match the notches from the top yoke in the back to the lower back. So I like to do a couple of different things. Not only will we be matching the notches, but I also like to match what I call touch points. these are the places that don't change regardless of the gathering. And so you make sure that if those line up, then the rest should come together perfectly. So with your back lower, right sides up, you are going to take your back yoke and lay it on top of that piece. You are putting them right sides together. Now, we will be matching the bottom edge of the back yoke with the top edge of the back lower. So you can start by finding your notches. Mine are a little hard to see, but they're right here. And match that up with the notches on the back lower. Grab either some pins or clips, whatever you want to do, and then do the same over here. Now, there's a chance that your notches might have been slightly off when you marked them, and that is why we use these other touch points as well. So before we start gathering, let's make sure that the other places match up. So take along that edge and just make sure that everything lines up and pin that outside edge. So this is the end of the shoulder piece, which you can see right here. This is where we just pinned, but in the back. So we know that this now matches up. So let's do the other side. So by doing all of these touch points, then when you actually start gathering, you know that the key places are all lined up. But if it's off at all, just adjust the gather. So if you can see here, this is lined up. If it feels like the back, it looks like there. Okay, so it's lined up from the outside point to that first notch. And then that center, there's all this extra fabric at the center back that will be gathered, and then we've confirmed that from the outside edge to that first notch is correct as well. So I like to then, once I've lined everything up, is flip it over so that the back lower is on the top now, because we're going to be gathering the fabric, and it's easier to see it when you're gathering with the fabric on the top. So if you remember, we take both tails from the bobbin and hold on to them and pull them at the same time so that you get nice, even gathers. Now it's gonna be, let's see. What you can do, it doesn't have to be perfect. Get the initial gather figured out, and then you can redistribute the gathers if you need to. Also, if you tend to like a lot of gathers, you could, if you're a B sewing cup, you could cut actually the D sewing cup back lower, and that will give you even more gathers at the center back. So once you kind of are happy with your gathers in this, and do any adjustments you need to, but we'll say once we're pretty happy with it, take another pin and pin the gathers to that piece. Once it looks like everything's lined up, you can go ahead and add any additional pins that you need in order to feel comfortable when you actually take it to the sewing machine to sew. Okay, so now that you have all of the pins together, you've got the notches matched up, the gathers between the notches, everything is ready to go. You could take it to the sewing machine now. What I tend to do though is do the other two, the front pieces, gathers as well, get everything ready, and then I can just take it all to the sewing machine and sew it together. So let me show you how I do those front gathers. The process is the same, but sometimes it's really nice to just see it a couple more times. So let's have a look at the front gathers. When you're working on the front gathers, make sure you use the correct front yoke with the correct bottom piece, because obviously they're mirror images of each other. So the easiest way is to just find your pattern pieces and confirm that this is the front neckline and this is the center front, and so these are the correct pieces. You'd hate to get sewing and then realize you used the wrong yoke piece. So as we did with the back piece, we are going to match up those touch points. Again, those are the points that aren't going to change regardless of the gathers. So you want to make sure all of that is correct, because you can make adjustments within the gathers, but if you start sewing and then realize somewhere you got off, you're going to have to take it all out. So let's take that front point, so right here, and we're going to pin that. And then we will pin the outside edge. And then let's match up those notches. So find the notch. There it is. Now, if your notches were off, just focus on making sure that everything outside of the gathers lines up. And then, gotta find that other notch. So again, we're making sure that it lines up to be the same length. It's hard to tell in this video, but it looks like my back notch, or the lower notch, got off by just a little. So that just means I adjust that a little bit. Okay, so you'll see we've got these outside points all lined up, we've got the notches all lined up, and then as we did with the other one, we flip it over so that we're looking at the wrong side of the back, of the front lower, and then we're going to gather them together. And it looks like, if you can tell, I did not leave very much of a tail. Make sure you leave a really long tail. So as we did with the back, do like an initial gather to get the right length, and then just distribute everything. Once you're pretty happy with those gathers, then throw a pin in it. So you throw a pin, add any additional pins that you need so that you feel comfortable when you're sewing. And then repeat with the other front piece. Once you have both front pieces and the back piece all pinned together and gathered into place, you will head to your sewing machine and sew them together. When you are sewing the pieces together, it's really important that you sew with the gathers on top. So arrange your fabric in the machine so that your gathers are on top. And the reason for that is, as you start sewing, if you need to make any little adjustments within the gathers, it's so much easier to do when you're looking at the gathers. So, fabric into the sewing machine with the gathers on top. your gathers done, you've got your pieces sewn together, you can remove the gathering stitches. So we'll zoom right in so that hopefully you can see this. There's lots of strings right now. But if you can see, we've got the top gathering stitch, the bottom gathering stitch, and then a much tighter stitch in between. That is our seam. So now that everything is secure, you can go ahead and pull those gathering stitches out. Because we did them so big, they just pull right out. So now your gathers are out. You can go ahead and reach inside, grab any of those extra threads that you need. There will be some in here. If you end up with any little holes in your fabric on the right side, so this is going to be for the lower piece, you might see some little holes. Just take it to your ironing board, give it a couple, rounds of steam, and those holes will go away. If not, run it through the washing machine when it's all done, and those holes will not be noticeable at all. Now that you've pulled out the gathering stitches, we are going to trim the seam allowance and then finish the seam allowance. You can do that in a variety of ways. You can do a zigzag stitch. It can be a wide, long zigzag stitch. You could cut it with pinking shears, or you can use a serger. Any method works. In fact, half of mine are done with a zigzag stitch and the rest are done with a serger. So it really does not matter. You don't need anything fancy, but we do need to finish the edges because when you wash this, that fabric will want to fray. So let me show you how I trim the seam allowance. Now, I'm probably living dangerously, but I actually use my rotary cutter. So let me grab my rotary cutter and I will show you. Okay, so I use my rotary cutter. Scissors just seem like too much work for me. So with the ruffles up, you want to make sure that the ruffles are up. You can just trim that seam allowance down to about 1/4 inch. See, it's that easy. That's why I use a rotary cutter. So you will do all 3 of your pieces, the 2 front pieces and the back piece, trim the seam allowance, and then we will get those edges finished. I went ahead and finished the edges with my serger, and if you are using a serger, you can skip the trimming step because your serger will actually trim the fabric while it finishes the edge. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next step, which is pressing the seam allowance towards the yoke, and then we will top stitch the seam allowance in place. So you will need an iron and an ironing board. So let me grab those and we will press. I prefer to work with the garment wrong sides up. I feel like that gives me a little bit more control, especially when we're also dealing with gathers. So you're gonna lay it out on your ironing board and take your iron and press that seam allowance towards the yoke. Now, I try not to iron the actual gathers too much. So I try to just kind of use the edge of my iron on that section right above the gathers. And then you will iron across the rest of the way. Now, we should really be pressing. So if you do this on your fabric, you're more likely to stretch it out. So you will just work your way across the fabric. I kind of do like this twisting motion to really push that seam allowance towards the yoke. And once you have that, you're going to go ahead and repeat that with your other 2 pieces. Now that we have all of our pieces with the seam allowance pressed towards the yoke, we're going to take it to the machine and top stitch that seam allowance into place. Usually when I top stitch, stitch, and I meant to mention this before we actually started top stitching, but I usually like to lengthen out the stitch length by a little bit. Remember, when I regularly sew, it's 2.8. When I baste, it's 4.5. So usually for a top stitch, I kind of just pick a random number around 3.2. That way it's slightly longer than a regular stitch length. Also, because we are top stitching about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam, I prefer to be able to use the presser foot as a guide. So instead of moving the fabric so that the needle is about 1/8 of an inch away from the folded edge, I find my guide, whatever that may be, and then move my needle. So however you choose to do it, just try to top stitch it about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam. So the next step is to sew the shoulder seams. The way that I find this easiest to do is to lay out your back piece with the right sides up. And then taking each of your front pieces, match up the correct front with the correct side of the back. There's only one way to do it. So match all of those up. And then you will be pinning it in place, whether you use pins or clips, whatever you need to do to feel most comfortable when you head to the machine. Like I've said, I think a million times at this point, I like to really pin my touch points inside neck and then at the elbow. That way I know if those two are in the correct spot, then I just need to pin everything in between. The other thing I like to do when I am doing something simple like this is, instead of pinning a shoulder, going to the machine, sewing it, coming back, pinning the next one, I like to pin both shoulders and then head to the machine and get both of the shoulder seams done, so that it's not entirely batch sewing, but it feels a little more like batch sewing, so that you're not making more work for yourself than you need to. Now, there is an option in the pattern to top stitch the shoulder seam allowance. So if you want to top stitch the shoulder seam allowance, you will follow the same steps you did for top stitching the yoke. So you'll sew it together, you will finish the edge, and then press that seam allowance towards the back yoke and top stitch in place. Today I'm not going to be doing that. This fabric, as I said, is pretty shifty, so I'm going to try to limit the amount of extra sewing I'm doing. So if you are skipping top stitching the shoulder seam, then you can actually save yourself another step and go ahead and pin the side seams. If you're going to be top stitching the shoulder seam, you wouldn't want to pin the side seams yet, because it makes that step so much more difficult. So by pinning everything, then we're going to go to our machine and make everything, sew everything together at the same time. I like any opportunity to save myself a little bit of extra work. Make sure when you head back to your machine that you change your settings, because we would have had our top stitching settings. So that means you possibly move the needle further to the side and you lengthened your stitch. So get that needle back down the center, and then also make sure you've put your stitch length back to what it was for just regular stitching. So one more side seam to go, and then we will head to the machine and sew all of these things together. And you know, honestly, the most time-consuming part of this pattern is what we are about to finish, because really the last few steps are putting in the bias, binding, and then we're just hemming. So you've done a bulk of the work already, and then we are going to have a top in no time. This is the side seams, and the shoulder seams is the rest of today's video, because bias binding, while I don't think is difficult, it definitely has a lot of steps. So I want us to start fresh with the next video, and we will go over the bias binding. Okay, so I got all of the side seams and the shoulder seams pinned. Again, if you are going to top stitch the shoulder seam, do not do the side seams yet. Sew the shoulder seams, finish the seam allowance, press it towards the back, and then top stitch in place just like you did with the yoke seam. If you're going to skip the top stitching on the shoulder, go ahead and pin both shoulders, both side seams, and let's head to the machine and get all of this assembled. I have to show you, it is actually starting to look like a shirt, which is the best part when you're sewing, is when you hit that point where it actually starts to look like a garment. So we are there. Okay, so if you remember from the steps previously, after we sew the shoulder seam and the side seam, we now need to trim the seam allowance and then finish the seam allowance. The process is exactly the same as it was for the yoke. I will use my trusty rotary blade, trim that seam allowance down to about 1/4 inch. It doesn't have to be perfect. Again, if you're using a serger, you can actually just have the serger cut the fabric while you finish the edges. Now, something that's a little bit different about the side seam as opposed to the yoke and the shoulder is that it's a really good idea, if you want to get a flat seam here so that it doesn't sort of bunch, is to go ahead into this this underarm and clip that seam allowance a bit. So this is similar to notching the back neckline. This allows the fabric to sort of, to move in that underarm seam. So once you have trimmed both of the shoulders, both of the side seams, then we will head over to the sewing machine again and finish that seam allowance. Again, you can use a sewing machine with a zigzag stitch you can use pinking shears. If you've never used pinking shears, these are pinking shears. You can see that they have basically a zigzag cutting, so it cuts your fabric basically at a zigzag so that it won't fray. So you have lots of choices. It doesn't require new machines. I mean, if you need a reason to get a new machine, you can definitely tell them that Kimberly from Straight Stitch Designs, them as in a spouse, a partner, your bank account, that Kimberly says a serger would be great, but it is not necessary, and I did not have one for years and years and years, and I made incredible garments, if I do say so myself. So make sure you clip that curve to give yourself a really nice curve, and then let's go ahead and finish those seams, and then we'll come back and wrap up today's video. So before we wrap up today and get ready for tomorrow's video, because although it's not difficult to attach bias binding, it definitely can, it takes a bit to wrap your mind around it. So let's start fresh with the video for tomorrow. But I did want to say that you did so much today. You essentially assembled the entire garment. You have beautiful finished seams on the inside, and you are all ready to tackle the last two real big parts of this garment, and that is the bias binding and then the buttonholes and buttons. So with that, make sure you have your bias binding all cut out. You've got 2 strips of interfacing, and we are going to get going on the bias binding in tomorrow's video.